vreau să spun că Stanley Robinson a fost unul dintre primii, cred că al doilea sau al treilea maxim, la care ne-am gândit când am început seria de evenimente Nautilus și cred că i-am scris prima dată acum un an. Să programăm ceva pentru primăvară-vară, dar mi-a spus foarte candid și drăguț că el pleacă în Antarctica din nou și era extaziat și atunci am zis ok, nu putem să ne punem cu chestia asta, așteptăm și deci cumva e programat cam de un an de zile, să spunem așa. Eu o să recunosc că sunt un pic intimidată de ce urmează să fac acum, pentru că chiar am citit Trilogia Marte acum 2 luni. Nu știam că o să țin eu interviu, deci de asta am citit-o de plăcere și în ultima săptămână am uitat numai la interviuri cu el și live și am citit și așa și sunt un pic complexată, pentru că mi se pare că este, dincolo de a fi un scriitor foarte bun și foarte epic în sensul adevărat, cu narațiune, personaje și tot ce trebuie, mi se pare că este un gânditor senzațional, adică temele pe care le pune în discuție în general, dincolo de narațiune, care țin de postcapitalism și de mediu și de ce facem cu noi ca omenire când ajungem în altă parte, sunt extrem de savuroase și te pun pe gândit rău de tot. Cu el, în seara asta, am ales niște întrebări care să fie, cred că generale, dar o să vedeți că față de gândirile celelalte, nu sunt atât de multe legate strict de literatură, sunt foarte multe legate și de cum vede el, cum ne vede el pe noi, pe oameni și ce crede că se va întâmpla în viitor. Ok, să începem, sper să fie bine, dacă întrem o vocea de asta, mă simt extrem de complexată intelectual. În acest moment. Hello, Mr. Robinson.
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, how about you?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much for taking the time to have this interview with us at the beautiful bookshop in Bucharest in front of some of your readers.
It's my pleasure.
And until we see you in the flesh, maybe in Romania at some point, this is the best we can do, the best we can hope for, a Skype interview with you.
Yes, I would like to visit, but until I stop writing novels, I don't have time to travel very much.
Except to Antarctica.
But yeah, but that made me late. I did that, but it made me late for this book. So now I'm, my contract, I'm not fulfilling my contract, but I had to do it for Antarctica. Yes.
Of course. We'll come back to that a bit later. So my first 2 questions are a bit of a blast from the past, let's say. I've read that when you were doing your graduate studies, you worked as a bookseller in a bookshop. And first of all, I was wondering if you had begun writing at that point, and how that experience made you see writers, readers, and selling literature.
Yes, thank you. I started writing when I was an undergraduate at college, and then I worked at a bookstore when I was a graduate student. So I was already writing, and I was writing also my dissertation and doing graduate classes, and I was also teaching a little bit freshman composition at the university. So the bookstore was good. It got me in contact with readers, and I got to also to think about who likes to read what, and when people ask for suggestions, it was a lot of fun because it felt like I was giving them little treasures that they didn't know about. So that was really the pleasant part of working in a bookstore. I also like to alphabetize, but beyond alphabetizing the bookshelves, I liked each author's books to be in chronological order, in the order that they wrote them. So, at least in the literature section, I was very obsessive. It was good.
So, this made me think of another question. If you were to be a bookseller right now in a bookshop that you know very well where you live right now, what book would you recommend to someone coming in and saying, I want to read something innovative?
Well, this might be something that they already know about, but if they didn't, I would send them to Elena Ferrante, the Italian novelist who wrote My Brilliant Friend, her Neapolitan Quartet. I think that quartet is just wonderful. And then also Patrick O'Brien, who writes historical novels. I guess he died about 10 years ago. And they made one movie, Master and Commander. His novels are also beautiful. And I guess the reason I would suggest them is because I love them a lot myself, but I also think that they are very accessible and easy for anybody to love.
Elena Ferrante is actually quite a phenomenon in Romania too. It was translated last year.
Yes, I'm not surprised. Those are great books, and she's a wonderful novelist. I'm filled with admiration, and as a reader, I just love her books. I'm interested in this thing that she does of being anonymous, that nobody knows who she is. And the journalist who revealed perhaps who she is, everybody hates this guy because she wanted her privacy. And I don't do what she does, but I also am completely off of social media. I don't do Facebook or Twitter or any social. I don't have a blog or a website of my own. My publishers do some things, but I don't. So I have a certain sympathy for her as being the one who is the craziest of us all.
Okay, going back to another blast from the past, let's say. You wrote your PhD thesis on the novels of Philip K. Dick, and it's clear that your styles of writing are quite different. So I was wondering what his literature brought to you as a writer, and which of his ideas do you feel closer to even today?
Well, thank you. I did do my thesis on Philip K. Dick, and I really admire his writing. He's a great writer. And I would say that although our styles don't resemble each other, he taught me how to structure a novel. So, and what I mean by that is that he always used this method of third-person point of view, where in each chapter you move to a different character, and you're inside the head of just one character per chapter, but in every chapter it's a different character. So that's what he taught me, is that method is very powerful for characterization and giving you a sense of a larger picture than just one character, like in first person. So I used his structure, and I also like his politics. He's a California writer, and he's an American leftist. And all of his works are very strongly anti-capitalist. And so in that sense, I think also I resemble his thinking, and I like his work in that regard. What I don't like about Phil Dick's work, or I have no sympathy for, is what I call the reality breakdown, where always in Philip K. Dick, you think you're in a real world, and then it turns out that the entire world is a 3D Skype thing, that you've fallen into by accident, or there's an underlying reality more real than the one that we're in. And I don't believe that. It's basically a metaphysical or a religious position. And Philip K. Dick is a kind of a religious writer or a philosophical writer. And I consider myself more of just an ordinary realist.
That brings me precisely to my next question. What were those readings or authors that made you be so sure to stick to future realism, as we may call it, instead of choosing, let's say, the more expansive sides of science fiction, like, I don't know, First Contact stories or Space Wars or technological gimmicks and so on?
Well, to a certain extent, I have to just write the ideas that come to me. So this isn't really as much a choice as it is just an instinct or a matter of having to write down the kind of ideas that occur to me. And so I don't have any space opera ideas. I don't know what happens out there that would make an interesting story. So I read Ian Banks, for instance, very great space operas, and he was a friend of mine, and I love his work, but my ideas don't lead me in that direction. So I guess you would say I'm interested in history, I'm interested in utopia, I am doing a kind of a realism. When you were brought up in California when I was young, reality itself was kind of a science fiction story, but it was a near future science fiction. So that's how come I ended up where I am, I think.
So you often place your stories at the point of new beginnings or having societies building themselves again or reinventing themselves. And I was wondering if that's a choice, a more narrative choice concerning your stories and your characterization, or is that more of a philosophical and moral stance to talk about new beginnings and building new worlds?
Well, it's somewhat an accident. And I think it's partly when you're writing utopias, the utopian tradition typically began with a society that got to have a fresh start. So in Moore's utopia, it's an island somewhere in the ocean. In Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, it's a moon that all of the people get sent to. And it's the same in My Red Mars, and to a certain extent in Antarctica. But I think that it's a weakness that it's important to actually to try to connect up utopian society to our current moment. So that I've gotten more and more interested in writing continuously from this moment to the moment of my novel without a break, without a new start, to see what we can do.
So do you believe that science fiction can raise awareness more than non-fiction? I mean, ideas are more appealing to readers if they're put in good storylines than they are if put in an objective discourse, let's say?
Well, yes. I think that nonfiction has an important role to play, but it's always going to be about one thing, or it's always going to be like the opinion section of a newspaper. So it will be about facts, or it will be about a single issue, or it will be some person's opinion. And then what the novel can do is try to add the texture of daily life, try to add a multiplicity of voices so that there's many different characters. So clearly it's still one writer, but if you're doing the novel correctly, you're kind of channeling a whole bunch of voices in a complete situation. And so what the reader of the novel gets is what I would call two science fictional experiences. One of them is time travel, because you get to go to other times and other places that you aren't living in yourself, and you get to be like an anthropologist or a visitor. And then the other is telepathy, that you get to be inside other people's thinking, and you get to imagine that you are knowing what other people are thinking, which of course we can't do in daily life. So novels make big claims, and these experiences are fictional experiences. You don't really time travel, you don't really read minds, but it's as if you've done that, and these are very powerful experiences. So I believe in literature. I think literature is, for me, a kind of philosophy or even a religion. It's the way that I get meaning out of the world.
So in terms of how you write, what comes first? The characters and the voices, or the ideas?
Oh, I think the ideas. It's basically just a single idea. Like, what if all the Europeans died in the Black Death? What would happen? Or what if we went to Mars? What would happen? Or what happens when climate change hits us? And then with that basic idea, you need a certain set of characters that will represent the attitudes towards the main situation. So if you're terraforming Mars, you need a character that doesn't like that process and wants it to stop. And you need someone to advocate it. So these characters are called out by the situation. And then the question is, can they become more than a type? Can they become an individual that you believe in as an individual? And I would say that's a matter of luck and of how many sentences you give to them.
So, in the years of rice and salt, and in your latest novel, New York 2140, you set your stories after a catastrophic event. And I was wondering if you feel that humankind right now needs a sort of cathartic restart, or is it because you think something will happen in our lifetimes?
Well, they both struck me as interesting stories. And so, since I'm a novelist, what I really want are interesting new stories. And in the case of the years of rice and salt, that didn't happen. So alternative history is a strange subgenre, but I wanted to try that one. With New York 2140, we are going already in climate change. It's going to be either more or less, but there's going to be some of it. And sea level rise is part of it. So it's worth thinking about right now, because we're beginning the process. So I think that I don't like to talk about apocalypse, and I don't like to talk about any kind of civilization crash. I think we'll be coping with these things as a high-tech civilization, and so that itself becomes interesting.
So you are still an optimist today?
Yes, but I can only say that as a kind of a philosophical position. So in other words, we do face some extremely dangerous problems, and I think you could say that the possibility for a mass extinction event, for a really bad future, is staring us in the face. So when I say that I'm an optimist, I'm not saying that I'm sure that we will come out okay. I'm saying that if we were to work at it, we could come out okay. So if that's being optimistic, I actually think that's just another realism. If we did things right, it could come out okay still. We're not past the point of no return.
So there is some optimism in there still. Do you feel that any of the things you pleaded for in your books have been fulfilled? Have people started doing them after so many years? Do you feel like some things that you kept very close and very dear are starting to happen?
To a certain extent, yes. I started to write about climate change with my Antarctic novel, and again in my Washington, D.C. trilogy, and that's 15 or 20 years now, and the whole world is paying attention in a way that they weren't 20 years ago. So that's progress for human civilization, and of course, I wasn't the first voice. I was just echoing what other people were saying, and especially what the scientists were saying. So that's been interesting and good to see. And also, I mean, I'm an American leftist, and of course right now we have President Trump, but we also have a really strong progressive movement, and I live in California, where it's an extremely progressive state, and it seems to be leading the world in some social technological ways. California is still somewhat the leading edge. So there are things to be positive about in terms of what's happened in these last 20 years. Obviously, we're in the midst of a big struggle.
So we know that Antarctica was a really formative experience for you. What did Antarctica teach you, and what do you think Antarctica can still teach the world about ourselves and about the future?
Well, it's when you're in Antarctica, you suddenly realize, yes, we're on the planet, and now we're down at one of the poles of the planet. it's really cold and there's nothing but ice. So it's like going to Europa or going out to Titan. You have a physical sensation of standing on a planet in a way that you forget when you're in a city and civilization. So I would say that's the main experience that makes it a kind of a science fictional experience. The reality of the planet is like a blow to the head. It's visual and physical and really quite exhilarating. It's a beautiful feeling.
So last year we translated in Romanian your novel Shaman, and probably most of the people here read it, so I was wondering if you could tell us why you chose to look so far back in the past after looking so much into the future, and what kind of research the book implied.
Yes, thank you for translating it. Thank you for reading it. I love that book, mainly because it is historical rather than science fiction. So if you're a science fiction writer, one part of the project is to say, what can human beings become in the future? When you ask that question, you have to think to yourself, well, what are human beings now? And how did we get here? How did we evolve to become the creatures that we are? So you have to look back into the past, and in particular to the deep past of the Paleolithic period, because we had a very stable lifestyle for thousands of years through ice ages, and we can tell this from the cave paintings. The cave paintings 32,000 years old at Chauvet, and the cave paintings at 17,000 years old at Lascaux and Altamira, they're the same style, and it implies that human culture, without writing, was able to stay stable for thousands of years in the middle of an ice age. And that I found really, really interesting. And so I wanted to explore, well, what was that culture like? How were they the same as us now, and how were they different from us? And the more I began to think about humanity without books, without literacy, without written language, the more I began to think that's the really different part. So in the novel, I was very interested in working on cave paintings. I was very interested in working on snow camping because I snow camp myself in the mountains of California. But the main thing was that the third wind who narrates this novel is telling it to you. He's talking it. It's not a written document. So I had to have a completely different style, and that made it, that and the feeling that something like what I wrote about must have happened. It had to be somewhat like that. Even though I'm sure that I have put 20th century minds and thoughts into their heads, because you can't avoid that. But something like their lifestyle in that book had to have really happened. And that made it a really fascinating project for me. It was compelling, and I felt like I was tapped into something bigger than myself, so that the book was going to be bigger than myself. So I love that project. If I could have kept writing Shaman forever, I would have written it forever. But I had to finish.
Well, it's certainly a great story and a beautiful plea for stories themselves, because actually those are the most important formative matters. The sensitive matters and the stories, the narrations.
Yes, that's true. They had to keep telling each other the stories to keep the culture going, and then the way that they would break into poetry and they would speak aloud to each other and tell each other stories. Well, it was a beautiful experience, and when I did the book tours for that book, I would read the story that Pippi Loette tells about trying to find the eastern end of the world, the walk that never ends. And that was really an electrifying thing to try to read aloud. It was often overwhelming.
Well, maybe you can read it sometime in Romania, like to us.
There would be the right spot.
Yeah. Going back to cosmic space, let's say, we have a question from a reader If you were to change anything in your Mars trilogy today, would you change anything, and what would it be?
Well, first, I wouldn't change anything. I think it is what it is, and I like what it is, and it's kind of a crazy book, and so I'm alienated from it, and I wouldn't want to interfere with it because I feel like it's not mine. The things that they've learned about Mars since then that I think should be discussed more is the possibility that there's bacterial life underground. That's a big issue, and it wasn't on the table when I wrote the books. And then the soil is way more poisonous than we thought it was. We've discovered that with our landers. And I would suppose that I would write more now about trying to deal with the poisonous soil. And I'd probably also shorten it. But see, that's bad. That's the instinct of someone that is no longer deep enough into it.
No, it has a life of its own. Now you have to let it be.
Yeah.
I think we all got the feeling we're living in a science fiction novel or movie when the first announcements of Elon Musk's projects appeared. But I know you have been among those who had several reservations about it. So, which are your main concerns about his plans, considering that you studied this a very long time?
Well, let me start by saying that I think that his company is great. SpaceX is great. The Falcon rocket, the Falcon Heavy, these are great rockets, and he's running a great company. Same with electric cars, same with solar power. So in that sense, I'm a big fan of him. He's got to be the most interesting billionaire and industrialist that we have. But I also think that his obsession with Mars is leading him to make some mistakes. And also he's trying to do fundraising. And he's turning into a salesman rather than a true engineer. And I guess the main thing that I think that he tries to gloss over that's way harder than he is saying is the landing on Mars. The landing on Mars is extremely difficult, and the bigger the rocket you land on Mars, the harder it gets. And our success rate is only 50% for landing even tiny little things. So when he talks about landing on Mars as if it's not a problem, it is a problem. And he's trying to say, don't look there. Just send me money. Invest in my company. So I don't like that because he doesn't need to do that. And I think because I've met almost everybody interested in Mars, in what you would call the Mars community, I know very well that some people want it too much, and they want it in their lifetimes. And I think it's a category error. I think they should go to Antarctica. Or I think if you really want to do space, that we should go back to the moon. That Elon Musk could have us on the moon with a little scientific station and a little hotel. He could do that in 5 years without any question, but he's not interested. So this is my thoughts about him. And of course he gets to do what he wants.
Of course. Another question from a more pessimistic reader, I think, is whether a new Cold War would lead to a new space race between the big powers in the world. What do you think?
Well, the Cold War was a strange moment. It seemed to suggest there were only two superpowers. They both were armed with nuclear bombs, and it was a fight for control of the world. We'll never be there again. And that said, I think China will go into space. I think China will go to the moon. That's what I'm writing about right now. A novel in which China takes over the moon, at least part of the moon, very quickly. They can do that, and I think they will. And I do think that would stimulate Europe and the United States and Russia to be more interested in going back to the moon than they are now. So ultimately, yes, I think national conflicts, competition between nation states will drive a little bit more space activity. And probably soon.
Okay. I have to ask you this because you're a very political writer, actually. In 2005, you said for The Guardian that you were living under the worst president of the United States. I was wondering what you are to say today.
Well, Donald Trump is a terrible president. But I will add this. George W. Bush authorized torturing people who were in captivity, and he started a war for no reason that has created enormous amounts of permanent damage in Iraq and killed hundreds of thousands of people. So Trump has not done that, and although he's an idiot, he may never do anything as bad as what George Bush did. And I hope, like anything, that that's true, that remains true. And that Trump is so clearly out of his depth and a narcissist that if he tried to do stuff as bad as George W. Bush, the people around him might stop him. And the American people might stop him. So it may be true that although he's ridiculous, that George W. Bush will remain the worst president ever. And I hope that's true.
Yes, that's a better idea. That your
Yeah.
statement in 2005 remains the same.
That's a true low point, yeah.
You always say in your interviews that we have to be aware that there is no planet B, no plan B, that it's only the here and now. And since you are such an influential writer, I wanted to ask you, what would you say to your readers they can do in their own lifetime and in their everyday life to focus more on planet A?
Well, thank you. I try to work on that in my own life. I write my books outdoors. I spend as much time outdoors as I can. And this comes out of writing Shaman. The idea that we evolved to be outdoors, and the more time we are outdoors, the happier we become. And that, of course, I still spend a lot of time indoors. I usually sleep indoors, except when I'm backpacking. But it's a good rule of thumb. Walk instead of drive a car, ride a bicycle if you can. I keep a vegetable garden. I eat what I grow, and this is very satisfying, and it's also good for the planet in terms of carbon burn. These are all small things, but if everybody did them, and even apartment dwellers can have a few vegetables in pots. And then also, if you can find a place to compost your food waste, you can begin to make your own soil, and you begin a cycle of growing your food, recycling it into your soil, using the soil to grow more food. And even though it's all very small on the large scale of the planet, and it's more important that we get big industries to decarbonize, and that we decarbonize energy and transport systems. But it's personally satisfying. It's psychologically helpful to be living a life that is more like the life that they were living in Shaman. That's what we evolved to do. And you want to be comfortable, and so did they. But the more time you spend outdoors and talking to people face to face, and what's weird is that I used to think, well, Skype, I mean, how good can it get? It's a quick adjustment to feel like we're face to face. And there's something important about that is maybe going to be the salvation of the computer time, the screen time. So many young people spend so much time on screens, but if it stays social and if it stays human, then that's not so bad. It might be a part of a good life.
Okay, point taken. I do not even want to pain you by describing how the recycling system works or doesn't work in Eastern Europe. You do not want to know. I don't want to ruin your day. But it's actually, I think it's very hard here to try to live healthily or to recycle, because you recycle at home, but then there are no recycling in the real industries to handle it. But anyway, let's stay positive.
Okay.
May I ask what you are working on now? You gave us a small hint.
Yes, I have this science fiction novel. I'm nearly done with it. It's basically about China, and about China taking over the moon, and the moon is nearly useless. So it's a way of talking about, again, there is no planet B. There's nothing but Earth. But it's a way of talking about that from an interesting story perspective, and taking us back to the moon. And then after that, I have ideas for another utopian novel. I'd like to do the utopia. And you know, I read a lot about Europe and also about Eastern Europe, and including Romania, because of English writers, Peter Dickinson, Paul Park. Romania is an imaginary space in Western culture. And all of Eastern Europe, each one of those countries have their own individual history. And the weirdness of the 20th century, the communist takeover and the Cold War years, followed by neoliberal global capitalism, is a kind of two disasters back to back. And it means that every nation state, especially the small ones, where the national language has 10 million speakers, has to figure out a way to be both itself and solve its own problems internally and somewhat autonomously, and also have a relationship with the rest of the world, including the global economy. And nobody has this figured out yet. But it's not going to last like it is right now. It's a work in progress. And so there are opportunities, I think, for every country. And here I'm thinking not so much the United States as I'm thinking California. California is not the same as the rest of the states. And so Romania doesn't have to be the same as the rest of the European Union. And so every political body, I think, now is up in the air, because it's becoming more important to the global and not so much the local, but the nation. The global and the nation are two things that have to be thought of together. So I think there's a lot, again, trying to be optimistic about this radical history that we've just all gone through. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the situation to improve and get quite good.
Thank you for those thoughts. We're still a very young democracy, so I guess we have to see where we learn from and where we fit in.
Yeah.
And what you told us about your next book sounds really exciting, and also your latest novel, New York 2140, probably a big scare for New Yorkers, because it's about a huge flood and New York becoming a sort of futuristic Venice for survival. It's very interesting. Let's hope we translate it soon.
I hope so too. Yeah. I love being translated into other languages, and I know that Romanian is a special language, being, you know, one of the Romance languages, but also off on the side, so that it's maybe it's more like Latin than the others, or maybe not. But I like it when you send me the books, and I keep a special shelf of all my translations. So it matters to me. It's a kind of magic, you know, since I don't speak these languages, to think that people are reading in these languages. I love my translators. I've met my French and German translators and gone to lunch with them. And I really appreciate and enjoy that aspect of my career.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. And it's like in The Shaman, it's stories traveling in different forms from one to another. And
yes.
My last question for you is, what are you reading now?
I'm reading Paradise Lost by John Milton, and I tried when I was a student and I didn't finish, and now I'm trying again 40 years later, and I still don't like it. There's something wrong with it. And then in terms of other fiction, I'm reading a new, well, he's not that new, a science fiction writer from Finland, Hannu Rajuniemi.
This is incredible. Our next guest is him in December. Our next Skype interview is with him.
Oh, good, good. Well, I will meet him tomorrow, and so that's why I'm reading him. We're going to do a dialogue on stage in San Francisco.
Wonderful.
So I'll tell him that he's going to have a good time next month.
Thank you so much.
A pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time. We're looking forward to your new novel and maybe sometime see you in Bucharest when you're not writing.
Yes. Well, let's say the year 2020. By that time, my wife will probably retire from her job as a chemist, and I will be done with this contract, and so then maybe we'll get to visit.
Noted.
Great.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. And bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Mulțumim că mi-ați suportat emoțiile. Mai mult de faptul că vă arăt dacă n-am înțeles. Cum complet întâmplător am zis acum, da, luna viitoare să fie Hannu Rajuniemi. Între timp tocmai am publicat al doilea volum din seria lui. Vă așteptăm și atunci, nu pot să vă zic decât să vă luați și prietenii, să le spuneți că e frumos și să veniți mai mulți. Mersi.
Unde să fie? În Anglia, în principiu, nu?
Nu mai știu că n-am văzut. Am văzut că el asta primăvară. Urmează.
Mă gândeam cât e de aproape ca cu Sorat, știi?
Păi, nu știu. Dacă e în America...